listening to Living with ADHD and CPTSD, available on Apple and wherever you get your podcasts. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Living with ADHD and CPTSD. Today I have a special guest on. His name is Tim Fletcher. He is from Winnipeg, Manitoba, and he's an expert with complex trauma, CPTSD. And he is on the show today to discuss his experiences and his understanding and knowledge of complex trauma in the world, and especially with addiction and recovery. Thank you, Tim, for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and your experience with complex trauma here?
Sure. About 20 years ago, I came out of a pastoral background and had health problems and had to resign from that. And a friend of mine, after a while, invited me to be a counselor at a treatment center in Winnipeg. And I finally agreed to, and it was the only treatment center in Canada at that time that saw addiction as a symptom of underlying issues that usually went back to childhood. And so that gradually kind of directed my focus into seeing addiction as a symptom of deeper problems. Gabor Mate came out with his book In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, which basically said everybody he dealt with addiction had childhood trauma. And that began to put words to what I was experiencing as a counselor in working with people with addictions. And then as research began to come out, it was defined as developmental trauma disorder first, then complex trauma, and then CPTSD. And so because I was working every day with clients, really began to research and wanted to understand this complex trauma piece better. So after doing that for a while, we started a Friday night program that we began to make this information available publicly. And then I wanted to see if anybody in Winnipeg was willing to change the treatment model for addicts around addiction. So I went to the different treatment centers and said, everybody's talking about trauma-informed. Is anybody willing to change their program? So we're actually dealing with the childhood complex trauma. And everybody said no.
Oh.
And I said, okay, then we want to talk about it, but nobody wants to help people deal with it. So in 2016, we started a treatment center in Winnipeg called REACT, Recovery Education for Addiction and Complex Trauma.
Nice.
Most of the treatment centers were seeing a 5 to 10% success rate. Within a year of us starting REACT, we were seeing a 60% success rate. And it was wow, when you deal with the root issues, because complex PTSD, what makes it such a difficult animal is the child in survival mode, because of their danger, is adapting, developing these ways of surviving. But now in adult life are maladaptive, and they're messing up their life. So they got to basically relearn life to develop healthy tools for coping, healthy tools for relating. And they got to get rid of all of these tools they had for surviving. So they got to relearn life. And that takes 1 to 10 years to get good at that. And nobody was willing to do a new program because everybody wanted to do a 28-day or a 2-month program only. So we started REACT, and we basically said we're going to teach people how trauma has affected them, healthy tools, healthy ways of coping, and we're going to continue to work with them for as long as they want to work with us. So we've been doing that now for 6 years and are just amazed with the results that we're seeing as we go about an approach that actually helps people deal with the complex trauma. Um, and so now we have people who come not with addiction issues, but with mental health issues, just with living issues, because they're realizing that trauma doesn't just show up with addiction. It shows
Yeah.
up in all kinds of maladaptive ways of coping. And we've come up with 60 maladaptive ways of coping that people have to become aware of, that they need new tools and new ways of coping. So that's kind of the big picture. We're in Windsor, Ontario now,
Oh,
because when COVID hit, most of my work went online. The
right.
whole React program we put online, and now it's international. People of the world are taking the program online. So my wife and I said, why put up with Winnipeg winters? Let's go to a warmer part of Canada, because we do everything online now. And so we moved to Windsor a year and a half ago. And
Oh, nice.
yeah,
Yeah, that's much better weather. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I know that complex trauma is still, for a lot of people out there, is still relatively new. Like it's the understanding of it is, I guess you could say, is like minor or minimal, because it's everybody focuses on the main one everybody knows is, which course is PTSD. And I know some people do kind of get that like mixed up or confused with complex trauma because they don't have a full understanding of it.
right.
And to make matters worse, like I know in the United States, where a majority of my listeners are, it's not even recognized in the DSM-5. So it's, I know that they just recently had, I can't remember who it's called, but some 11, like I don't remember, I should have written this down, but there's I think the World Health Organization has their own official recognized, like where it recognizes it, and there's 11 characteristics or something like that for complex trauma. So it's definitely getting more, it's picking up steam here. But there's still a lot of people who are not aware of it, and there's a lot of different signs of it. Like when I do my episodes every week, I have way more listeners that are for complex trauma than with ADHD, because if you look online, there's all sorts of information about ADHD, but even when you do a search for complex trauma, Google automatically goes, "Do you mean PTSD?" Like it doesn't even, so you're constantly having to go, "No, I definitely meant complex trauma." And so the understanding everywhere is, it's just there's still a lot of information that needs to be discovered, and there's different theories that are out there when it comes to like how understanding it, what is going on in the mind. I don't know, you may have heard of it. I would think is that one of the ones that is quite new is structural dissociation. And I've heard a lot of good information on it, but it seems like every time I mention it to people, a lot of them haven't heard about it. Like I'm talking people who have complex trauma. And whenever I explain it or I give details about how it works and the theory behind it, it really, it kind of makes sense to them, because they go, "Oh yeah, I can see how that works in the mind." And honestly, to me it works really well, like the idea behind it, because it's when you sit down and you actually look at it, it goes, yeah, there's like you said it yourself, there's like you're developing coping mechanisms as a child to help you get through, especially when you are experiencing the trauma and the abuse in that moment. They're developing their own methods to cope and to deal with it. And then as an adult, they're getting triggered, and they're having these they call it parts coming up that are trying to protect them,
Right.
but then they're not in time and place. So there's this whole issue where they have to reconnect with them and understand them and learn who they are and get them to trust, like, so that they can heal and move forward in this problem.
Yes, if I can just say a few things around that, Russ, that
Sure.
to help people. I think we've been trained as a culture with the word trauma to just think of big T type trauma. I would call it horrific events.
Yeah.
And so when we hear complex trauma, we just think in terms of big T trauma. And we go, I don't have big T trauma, so I don't have complex trauma. And I go, no, that's not right. So big T trauma is really technical, is simple trauma. And the idea of simple is one time. Simple number is a one number. So complex trauma plays off of that. And so it's more than one or ongoing. So the reality becomes what does it mean for a child to live in an environment where they feel danger all the time, ongoing. Yeah. So take that further. In big T trauma, you get PTSD. And so what happens is you're going along living a fairly healthy coping, you're loving, you're responsible, you're balanced in your life. But then a big T event hits and you go into survival mode temporarily just to get yourself to a place of safety. Then you relax again, you go back to living a very balanced, mature life again. So you adapted for a very short period of time, but then you went back to your healthy coping tools. So that's your simple trauma. You might still have some PTSD symptoms of flashbacks and getting triggered, but for the most part, you're back to using your healthy toolkit again.
Yeah.
What the big difference with complex trauma or ongoing danger is you adapt for that ongoing danger, but the danger doesn't go away. You don't get yourself to a place of safety. It's unresolved. And so now you have to keep using that tool over those survival tools over and over and over again. And then they become your way of coping. They become wired into your brain. This is what you do. So now they become maladaptive. So you don't trust people. You lie, you wear masks, you control, you have authority issues, all of these ways of surviving as a child to keep yourself safe were your adaptations, but because it didn't fix the problem, the danger didn't go away. Now, when you hit the adult life, what happens when you lie and manipulate and control and wear masks? Well, you don't have healthy relationships. You don't hold on to jobs. Your life falls apart. So they become maladaptive. So that's part one in understanding the difference between PTSD, big T trauma, and complex trauma is what happens when you're in ongoing danger that you can't resolve. The second thing is big T trauma is always horrific trauma. Complex trauma is a spectrum from horrific to very mild. So we summarize it in two ways. It can be abuse type trauma, horrific, or it can be neglect trauma. Both have the same result in the brain. And so the best way for me to describe neglect trauma is parents meet the child's physical needs, but they don't meet their emotional needs. They're there for them physically, but they're not present for them emotionally. They're not connected emotionally. And what we're seeing is the results of that are just as awful as big T abuse trauma, because the child still feels all alone. The child feels abandoned. The child feels they don't matter. And so it has the exact long-term effects on the child as horrific abuse type trauma. And that's been such an important discovery, is that neglect, even though the child's not being physically abused, sexually abused, is still causing the child to go into fight, flight, because now they're adapting to get noticed, to try to connect. They're adapting to try to be respected, to fit in. And all of those are just trying to survive and get love, but they end up as maladaptations later. And so
Right.
the subtle forms of complex trauma, the child goes, oh, I never went through trauma. Oh, yes, you did. You just didn't know it was trauma. But you were
Yeah.
adapting all the time to get your needs met, and those were messing you up for adult life.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That actually is, that reminds me of my first experiences when I was, the first time I went to see a psychologist. This was a few years before my present one. I thought a root of my trauma was related to like my mid early teen years, where in school, and I always thought that this is where everything started, because I was often bullied and teased, and I was different when I went to school. And so whenever I would think about my issues and why I was behaving the way I am, or why I have such a problem with communication, or in relationships when things are difficult. And then I remember my initial consultation before I saw my therapist. It's the going back even further to, like, 4 or 5 years old kind of setup, and then you start to have memories, and you're remembering, like, I'm going, oh yeah, now I think about it, and I go back, and I go, yeah, okay, I'm seeing that it's actually coming from a much earlier time. And but the reason that I didn't think it was from there is because I was never really, like, I faced discipline from I grew up in a time where discipline was, like, the type of discipline I received was considered acceptable and normal. And but it was it was more of a lack of parenting in the emotional and the supportive way. Like, they when things, like, when I was behaving in school like a bad child, or someone who's really hyper, or doesn't get along with people, they didn't really know how to deal with it. It was like, they think, oh, he's just very active, or he needs to have more discipline. And then they never think about the other aspects of why. And so you grow up with it, and along with the parent who's got a short temper and lashes out, it grew and it grew and it grew, and it just was, it didn't start in school, it just was made way worse because there was no support, like, nobody to go, yeah, I understand, it's okay, like, helping you get through it. It's like nobody there behind you going, this is how you deal with this, or this is why. So it never had any, there was never any way of fixing it, or making, or support behind, like, no support group, I guess you could say. And yeah, like, it was more of a neglect in an emotional and in an upbringing. And then you don't realize it until you're an adult, when you're able, as with an adult mind, and like a fully developed mind, you're not able to truly see what was happening. And then as you learn, it becomes clear. It's there finally, instead of, because as a child, you don't know what, you don't really know, you don't understand, you're living it in the moment. And so, yeah, your mind is growing up in that kind of a lifestyle.
And you're adapting, but it's very much all your subconscious mind is just trying to find solutions because
Yeah.
you're in a bit of pain and frustration. Yeah, and I think one of the key things to me in discussing complex trauma is, so when you were growing up, when I was growing up, what parents were being taught is their priority is that their children obey.
Yeah.
behavioral model, and so you use discipline, you're firm. So there were some good things out of that, but it got out of balance, and so children have, like, we've identified 60 needs that children have: physical needs, emotional needs, spiritual needs, intellectual needs, relational needs, all kinds of different needs. But some of those needs are to be accepted for their personality, to have fun and play, to be curious, um, to be nurtured, to have tenderness. All of those different things are part of what a child needs emotionally. But back then, parents were, it wasn't about your child getting your child and understanding your child. It was about your child obeying and getting you and doing what they're
Yeah.
doing. And so a lot of children were growing up having all their physical needs, but parents didn't get them. Parents didn't take time to get them. And so we're not wanting to blame parents, but we want parents to understand is that model of parenting for many children did damage.
Exactly.
Because when nobody gets you, it's a very lonely world, and you don't feel like you fit in anywhere. And all of a sudden, you're just feeling all this internal anxiety and depression building that you don't know what to deal with because of that. And so most people with complex trauma end up with anxiety and depression issues. But more than
Yeah.
that, as a little child, you're feeling it's my fault. I must be
Exactly.
doing something wrong. I must have something wrong with me. I must not be good enough. So your whole identity is growing, your self identity is growing to be a very negative thing instead of a positive thing. And that to me is where the
Absolutely.
core of the damage begins to happen, is how it shapes the identity of that infant child to be a negative thing, which is so
Yeah.
sad.
Yeah, absolutely. Like for the longest time, it was only just recently that I've come to understand that a lot of what I experienced wasn't the first time. Like it wasn't just me all of a sudden experiencing it. Like my parents, well, most more so my father, he grew up in a family that had it kind of even worse than what I had. Like I wasn't necessarily like I wasn't physically abused in a manner that's considered like child abuse, but him and his siblings grew up in a family that was even more conservative, like, right, like there was no such thing as mental illness or discussing their mental needs or their emotional needs. It was purely survival. Like, they didn't exactly have a lot of money, so it was all survival. And they dealt with parents who always fought, and then a father who was abusive and took sides and had favorites, and both sides, like the sisters and the brothers, all had to deal with it as they grew up. And then I learned even more so that their father went through it himself through his siblings. And it's like a generational, where it just gets passed on, and no one ever really did anything about it, because it was never discussed. It was like, you just do what you know, and what you know is that your children have to learn to be disciplined, and to listen to you, and to obey to what you're telling them, and they have to grow up strong, and be able to work, and survive, and take care of their family. But there was never any discussion on the emotional side about the intellect. Like, how are you doing inside? Like, how's, like, it was never discussed. It wasn't even a thought.
Exactly. Yeah. So how I teach that to people is complex trauma, the original source is always outside the family. So somebody in the family was traumatized by somebody outside the family, but they didn't have the tools to deal with it.
Yeah.
And because of that, and they had to be strong, or they were shamed for talking about it, they carried it alone, but then they passed it on to their children.
Yeah.
And so complex trauma started outside the family, but then it's passed on generationally within the family. So we start hurting each other. And that's, to me, again, it's one of the sad things that comes out of complex trauma is if we don't deal with it, we just hurt the next generation.
Exactly. Yeah. The one thing I've had in my mind is that the idea of raising children, I need to have my personal issues at least at a state where I'm not putting it on them. Like if I'm having a problem, if I'm struggling with a trigger or trauma and I'm not doing well, I need to be able to not pass it on to the, like, put my anger or my issues through them, and then they feel it and now they're dealing with their own trauma. I need to be healthy enough so that I can deal with it on my own and not put it onto them. That's
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like the big picture around complex trauma is it shows the power of parents. And
Yeah.
children don't just pick up what we say, they pick up our attitudes. They're affected by how we think, they're affected by everything we say and do. And so if we're not working on our stuff and getting healthy, then we potentially are passing on unhealthy stuff. And so it's just the power of the influence that we have. It's great if we're using that responsibility or that authority in a healthy way. But when we're abusing that, wow, the damage. And that's what complex trauma shows, is the damage that we can do when we don't use that position of authority properly because of our own crap.
Yeah, exactly. I was When you said that, even the thinking and your like, it doesn't necessarily have to be verbal or physical. It's just patterns, because you're right. Like, you have a parent that does a certain behavior when they get upset or when something unexpected occurs, and how they deal with it, especially if that child is right there. And that was an example with me, is seeing it firsthand. It wasn't necessarily directed towards me at times, but even just seeing it and absorbing that, and like that, it reflect it. I learn it, and I either think that it's normal and reproduce it towards, like, people I know or my children, or I go, that's not appropriate. But you're not able to confront. Like, I couldn't exactly just go to my father and say, that's not appropriate. It's like, he's not the kind of person that you could have done that to. But yeah, like, children pick up stuff, everything. Like, it's not just the verbal words that are said to them or the physical behaviors. It's there's so many little things that occur that affect that child, and then they use it in their own life as they're growing up and into adulthood, and they don't even realize necessarily where it comes from.
So where a lot of research is now happening is realizing, okay, so complex trauma mainly takes place pre-verbal. It's from infancy. So how does a child learn about emotions? How does a child learn how to regulate or manage emotions? Well, through their parents. They pick up vibes. They look into their eyes. Mother soothes them. Mother talks to them, and then they learn how to soothe themselves and regulate their own emotions. But if mom's not regulated, if mom's stressed out, then they're not feeling safe to connect. They're not then able to, it creates their own anxiety, and they don't know what to do with it, and mom's not helping. And so all of that is, they're just picking up off mom and dad's emotions.
Yeah, exactly.
And so if mom and dad aren't in an emotionally regulated place, then they're picking up that, which then makes them feel anxiety and not safe. But then they can't regulate their own emotions. So that in itself is a subtle form of trauma for a child.
Yeah, totally. I get that. Wow. I know it's amazing how the smallest things can do that. It's that you like you said earlier. There's that misconception that it's big events that shape someone, but it's not. That's not true. There's everything. There's the little things. There's the inconspicuous events that occur regularly is shaping that child's emotional development, and they reproduce and repeat what they see and hear and learn.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So, all right, question I have is what inspired you to want to become involved with helping people that suffer from complex trauma and addiction?
That's a question that's quite interesting. Um, so this when I had resigned and I had been on 2 years of disability, and when I had I was thinking of I got to get back to work. What am I going to do? This friend of mine came to me and says, "I really think you'd be great as an addiction counselor." And my first response was, "No, not interested. Don't think that's for me." Um, so my friend just kind of let it go. But they came back to me a couple months later and they said, "Tim, I really think you should give some thought to this." And I said, "I don't really think that's where my life is headed." But I said, "Okay, I'll go for the interview."
Right.
And I went and they offered me the job. And what I told the boss was, "Okay, I don't know if this is really where my heart's at, but I'll give it a whirl. And if it works out, great. If it doesn't, like within a few months, I'll let you know." Well, within the first week of sitting with clients, beginning to explore their deeper issues. So what's the pain you've been trying to solve with addiction? What's the danger you've been trying to escape with addiction? When I started talking to people at that level, all of my own going through disability and health problems, what I'd learned the hard way through all of that. And I should just say, living with a chronic illness is living in a complex trauma environment because it's not safe and you can't resolve it. And the danger is to go to fight, flight, or freeze. Um, and that was depression issues and anxiety issues and physical health issues that I was dealing with. So I had to learn a lot of what I know today just from experience. Um, so when I sat in that room with those clients on that first day, I went, wow, I think this is where I'm meant to be. Something has just felt at home and connected. And after
Wow.
that, it was just moving forward. Um, and then with all the new research that was starting to come out, that I had the privilege of being kind of part of developing and teaching, it
Right.
was just to see the results of how it was changing lives. It was like, this is one of the most fulfilling fields in the world to be in as far as watching people's lives change right before your eyes. It is so rewarding, but challenging, but so rewarding that I just fell in love with what I did.
Wow. Yeah, it's definitely it's probably the best time to be in this because it's just starting to come out and grow. Like the exposure to it is just beginning. Like the number of people who are realizing that they've been dealing with trauma in their childhood it's amazing that it's starting there's more and more people who are suddenly realizing they're waking up and going, oh my god, this is what's happening. Either they're told or they just through research or find checking out online, why is this happening to me, and all of a sudden it just comes up and they're just like, it's there, but it's still it's in like early stages of discovery and learning here.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And I would
So
say,
yeah.
even what I've seen in the last 5 years is a huge mushrooming of growing awareness. We still got a long way to go, but it sure is
Yeah.
better than 15 years ago when I really started to begin researching and teaching it. So
No
it's
kidding.
coming. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you talk to clients that are struggling with the trauma and addiction, what do you find seems to be the most difficult issue? Like, what is the one that seems to appear a lot is when you're talking to them?
Well, I would say if I can come at that from two directions,
Sure.
Russ. Um,
Sure.
so the first thing I think is a lot of clients come in with the Western medical model in their mind. And the Western medical model is you've got pain, you go to see a doctor, he does a surgery, gives you a medication or a therapy, and within 6 weeks you're all better. And it's a straight line, it's simple. And so people come in saying, give me 3 easy tools that over the next 6 weeks I'll be fixed. And so it's realizing that we have to totally rethink the healing model when it comes to complex trauma, because the Western medical model does not work. And so the new model is basically there's 3 parts to it. So number one is you have to establish safety. People can't get healthy and heal from trauma unless they feel safe. So you have to develop a safe place for them,
Right.
which is a challenge. Then secondly, you have to help them begin to understand how trauma affected them. But that's risky territory because for many, they're going to start thinking about their trauma, which is then going to trigger them, which is then going to make them feel unsafe. So you've got safety, you've moved forward to start to process how it's affected them, but now you're back to not feeling safe again. So you just bounce backwards. So you recreate a sense of safety, you give them tools, they grow a bit, but then you go to the next area of trauma and they bounce backwards again because they don't feel safe again because they're triggered. So you're back and forth in the first 2 for quite a while. And then once you get enough tools, now you go to the third thing, which let's begin to move forward in life again. Let's get into kind of relationships, jobs, becoming more responsible. Well, that's challenging because as soon as you go back into relationships, complex trauma took place in the most intimate relationships possible in a family.
Yeah. Yeah.
So now you're asking them to go back into intimate relationships again, the very thing that caused the trauma, and that's going to trigger their deepest wounds.
Mm-hmm.
And so now you're back to not feeling safe again. So you got to go back.
Yeah.
So what you find is this is not a straight linear healing process. This is a forward a step, back a step, forward 2 steps, back a step, moving out into new life, back to finding safety again, reprocessing triggers. So it's a back and forth, and it takes a lot of time. The second piece with the healing model is, so most of the way that a child copes with complex trauma becomes programming in their subconscious brain because it happens so young in life. They're adapting so early that it's subconscious brain. So if you think of learning to ride a bicycle at age 4 or 5, you practice and practice, excuse me, you practice and practice riding your bicycle until it's become part of your subconscious programming. So you can be talking to your friend, you can be looking around, but you're still steering your bicycle because it's in your subconscious programming now. So if I was to ask you at age 40 or 50 that I'm going to give you a new bicycle so that when you turn the handlebars to the right, you're actually going to go to the left. You in 1 second can understand that concept.
Yeah.
And you go, okay, I get the concept. That's simple enough. Now try to implement that concept. Yeah. And what they find is it takes about a year for a person to learn to ride that type of bicycle, because if they're really, really concentrating, they can bring the subconscious programming to the conscious level and change it. But what happens when they're riding that new bicycle and a friend comes along and says, "Hi, Russ, how are you doing?" You go back to your subconscious programming of riding a bicycle and you turn your handlebars to the right and you expect to go right and you run into a tree because you actually turn to the left. So what you find is we can change subconscious programming when we bring it to a conscious level.
Right.
But we don't consciously bring it in a conscious level. It goes back to subconscious because we've got other things on our mind. And so it takes about a year to relearn how to ride a bike. And so what you find is if you had all this subconscious programming for life developing at 6 months, 1 year, you're looking at 5 to 10 years to change all of that programming and make it a new type of programming. So this is not a 6-week process. This is looking at working at a slow process. And so people don't like that when they've got the Western medical model, because that is slow and messy. And we don't do slow and messy well in the West.
No.
We want quick fixes. So that's
totally.
That's the first part that we have to deal with. The second part is, so for some people, they innately have to be able to talk about and reprocess some of the pain and the trauma because they've got the big T stuff that they had lots of in life, physical abuse, sexual abuse. And so they need to be able to get to a point where they can at least have tools to not be triggered constantly by that painful stuff. So that's where actually a lot of the PTSD type of emotional regulation, dealing with triggers, EMDR, tapping or emotional stuff is so important, is just to give people tools to not dissociate, to be present, to regulate their emotions, to process through all of that stuff. So that's the next piece, and that's a big part. But once they get through that, then you actually get to all of the different maladaptive ways of tools that they use to survive, which is usually a lot of fear-based stuff.
Yeah.
So dealing with fear, but so there's two kind of key root deep things, which I would call the biggest ways that complex trauma affects. So number one is it changes your self-identity from positive to negative. So you have a shame identity, which is anybody that gets to know me is going to reject me or abandon me or not want to get to know me. And so I have a fear of intimacy, a fear of being abandoned, a fear of rejection, a fear of criticism. So all kinds of fears come out of shame. And so to recreate a new identity is huge. So what I tell clients is this: if you've ever been to a house of distorted mirrors, where does a child pick up his identity? It looks into the mirror of mom and dad. And if mom and dad are reflecting a distortion, which is, I'm not going to spend time with you and connect with you, and I'm going to neglect you, the child is here in distortion. I'm not good enough. I'm not lovable. I'm not valuable. And then if the only types of validation I get is because I'm busy, I'm working, accomplishing, or I have a beautiful body, or I get straight A's, then all of my value comes from externals, never from internal.
Right.
So I got distorted mirrors all my life. And then I live in a culture that says, unless you're beautiful, have the perfect body, and have this kind of house and this kind of job, you're not good enough. So I get distorted mirrors from culture. Then I go to an education system where unless I get straight A's or really good A's, I'm not good enough. So distortions. Now, if you grew up in that, a child that grew up, let's say, in a house of distorted mirrors, so they're actually 6 feet tall and very thin, but the distorted mirrors say they're 4 feet wide and very short, and they only see distorted mirrors every day. If they were to go to a friend's house and they had accurate mirrors that said they're 6 feet tall and very thin, they go, something's wrong with that mirror.
Right.
And so what happens now when people come out of complex trauma with distorted mirrors that say you're not good enough, you're not valuable, you're not lovable, and they come out into adult life and they hit accurate mirrors that say you're lovable, you're valuable, you go, what's your agenda? What do you want from me? or you're just
Totally.
saying that to be nice. You don't really mean it. If you really knew me, you wouldn't say that. So, one of the hardest issues that just about everybody from complex trauma has is shame,
Yeah, no kidding.
a false identity that's negative. But to recreate that into a positive one after years of distorted mirrors, we've been trained to not believe accurate mirrors.
Okay.
And so that's a huge challenge. And
No
then
kidding.
the fears that come out of that is, again, fear of rejection. If you get to know me, you're not going to want to connect with me. So another way to say that is a child comes into the world believing that two things are important: being authentic and connection. And they believe if I'm totally authentic, people will connect with me. What happens in complex trauma is if they're authentic, nobody connects with them.
Right.
So their first adaptation is don't be authentic, then people will want to connect with you. So what we basically say to people is in complex trauma that to connect, they can't be authentic. But what you then realize is to truly be healthy, you have to be both authentic and to connect. And that is one of the scariest things for people from complex trauma because their whole history says that authenticity equals zero connection. It equals
Yeah.
rejection, it equals criticism, it equals lack of acceptance. Um, and so for people to become authentic is scary. It triggers all these fears of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of criticism. So healing then is fighting the deepest fears that come out of the shame stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
And so
Makes sense.
to get healthy, you're actually fighting fear every step of the way.
Yeah. I totally agree. I have my own. I think when you were talking about the shame and authentic being authentic, I have tons of memories of being in a situation, and then when I had like when I was like on my own for a few minutes while waiting for that person, or you had time to think. I remember thinking to myself and going, "This doesn't feel real. It just like this. Like, am I deserving of this? Is this really happening to me?" Or and you're kind of doubting yourself and wondering if like you can't. You're having a hard time accepting that this is legit. This is true and real. And then so you start to second guess yourself. And then of course, like you said, you get triggered, or and then all of a sudden, or you're feeling anxiety come on because you start to think, okay, now like all of a sudden now you're instead of just being yourself and feeling calm and like you now you're second guessing yourself, or you're being analytical, and you're it's like you're in the back of your mind going, okay, now I got to make sure I do this right. I got to, like you're being careful. You're not just walking on the ground. You're making sure every step you take is a safe step, is the right step. And yeah, and then that person, it's like that, especially if it's your partner, they're going to all of a sudden go, something's different. Like,
Exactly.
what happened, right? And yeah,
Exactly.
I've experienced that plenty of times because it's yeah that you haven't accepted, and you don't feel authentic around someone because you think, like you said, if the second that you show your true self, they're going to suddenly go, whoa, that you're not the person that I want to be around, or you're not I don't like you now. So you can't, you have a hard time being authentic without having triggers or feeling anxious because of your past and all that trauma.
Exactly. Exactly.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
we say one of the characteristics of complex trauma is you long for connection and intimacy, but you're afraid of it
Yeah.
because as soon as you get it, you go, oh, now they're going to get to know me, and then they're probably going to abandon me or reject me once they get to know me. So Another way to say all of that is when you have a shame identity, you develop an inner critic in your brain
Mm.
that then criticizes everything you do to say, "Oh, you shouldn't have done that. What are they going to think of you now? You just look stupid." By criticizing everything you do is not good enough.
Yeah. No kidding.
So shame, I
So,
would say,
yeah.
is the core issue for most people that comes out of
Wow.
trauma, and it's
I can
massive.
see that. Yeah. That's so true. Yeah. Okay. Now, you said in the past, and obviously I've watched a lot of your videos. How does religion help with those who are dealing with addiction and trauma? Like, because you do a lot of where you kind of use biblical and religious examples and stories to get across what's happening, like, and what they're going through. Like, how does in your mind, how does that help people?
So I would make a distinction. I don't think religion helps, to
Okay.
be
Okay.
really honest. But I do think the spiritual has importance. And the spiritual, to me, there's a wisdom from the generations of different spiritual traditions that we can all learn from. And so that's all I want to do is bring some of the wisdom of spiritual traditions to people that just help them understand um, their life in a bigger context and from different perspectives.
Hmm.
So another way to look at it is a person that's healing from complex trauma. What they begin to realize is they've built their whole life not knowing who they are because they've been running from themselves. They've been in fight, flight, freeze, fawn mode for most of their life, survival mode. Um, they haven't allowed, they've dissociated from their inner world and thinking deeply about anything out of fear, out of pain. They just don't want to go there. They've shut down a whole bunch of themselves, their emotions, etc., because of just trying to survive. And so what they begin to realize is they've built this house called their life that's on a very shaky foundation and isn't necessarily built out of the best materials. And so they have to kind of do a deconstruction, which basically says, I got to deconstruct this to find out what lies have I been believing? What have I been told that's the truth? What's the lie? What have I done that's healthy? What have I done that's unhealthy? What are my healthy? And they got to rethink life. And one of the things that they realize is I have to be open to stuff that I haven't been open to in the past. I
Right.
can't just build it with the same materials on the same foundation. I got to be willing to rethink life and be open to stuff. And so, where a lot of people end up is they realize, I think I need to look into value in the spiritual because I can't just do this, me, myself, and I alone. I do need
Yeah.
other people, and I do need a spiritual wisdom, a spiritual values, a spirit. So that's really what I wanted to introduce to people is just to give them permission to explore the spiritual. And I
Okay.
don't mean spiritual, I don't mean religion. I mean, it's a way of looking at life, at the world, a core set of beliefs and values about what makes for true happiness and success. That is really a spiritual belief system.
Okay. That's yeah. I see what you're saying, and that makes a lot of sense. It I could see how that would be very helpful, like in a person's ability to understand what has happened and give them kind of like a almost like a guide or a
Yeah.
like yeah, I totally see that. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my
Okay.
intent is not to convert anybody to a religion.
No, no.
It's to just introduce that part of because in our Western culture, it's probably the most neglected part of who we are. Um, we do great at meeting physical needs. We do poor job at meeting emotional needs, but we're aware of that. We do
Yeah.
great at meeting intellectual needs, But for the most part, we do a terrible job of meeting spiritual needs unless we try to shove a certain religion down people's throat. Um, and it's to really help people think that part of their life through in a way that they can begin to have freedom to explore it.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I agree with that. Huh. Okay, so I'm I feel that in the next 10 or 20 years that there's going to be a real heavy large increase in diagnosis. Like more and more people are going to start to notice, and they're going to be coming out and say, and being told or realizing that they've suffered trauma, childhood trauma, and however they in whatever form it came. And the thing is that society today, as we're aware of, is still just starting to understand and accept mental health and mental illness. And then that, like, no one really knows for sure what's going to happen in the next 10, couple decades. Like, what what do you think needs to happen as far as in society? Because there's a social aspect of it, right? There's the cultural aspect. Different cultures around the world have different beliefs, and some are more open and or I guess you could say liberal, and some are more conservative. And then there's obviously that environmental aspect. Like, what do you think needs to occur in the future so that, let's say, my child, like, I'm not saying my child necessarily, but like a child who deals with trauma today, when they're in their 20s, is going to have a much better chance of being diagnosed and healing, or even preventing, like, before it even occurs. Like, what needs to occur today or needs to be done so this is better for society?
And if I can just come at that from two directions.
Totally, yes. Yes.
So the first is, to me, there's always, whenever we change kind of a culture, there's a top down and a bottom up. So the top down is from the education system down through politics, etc. The bottom up is just grassroots. People start to word of mouth share what they're learning, and
Yeah.
so both of them to me play a part in changing how we look at things within a culture. Um, the second thing is, so Dr. Bruce Perry to me is one of the leaders in understanding childhood trauma and the brain. And so he's written a book that came out in 2020 called What Happened to You, which is 40 years of his experience that he just
Yeah.
synthesized into this very, very good book. But basically, what he said is, if you look at homelessness, the justice system, people in jail, people who's got children in in the child system, the welfare system, people who are involved in prostitution, people in the mental health. What we've done as a way, as a culture, is say, what's wrong with you?
Yeah.
We've looked at the symptoms and we've judged them. He says we got to start asking a new question, which is what happened to you? That these are
Makes
symptoms
sense.
of deeper stuff. And he said, if so, it's very interesting to me. If you look at homelessness, over 90% of people who are homeless, complex trauma. Over 90%
Mm.
of people in prison, complex trauma in childhood. Over 90% of people with addiction, complex trauma. Over 90% of domestic violence, complex trauma in childhood. So it's instead of saying what's wrong with you, say what happened to you. Let's start dealing with the root. And parents have to be willing to say, we did the best we could with what we knew at that time. But sadly, because we didn't know as much as we did things that hurt our children. And we got to own that instead of saying, quit blaming me. Um, we have to own that we didn't do as good a job parenting. let's change together. Let's both work on our stuff together.
Right.
Um, because what parents have done in the past has said, my child's got an eating disorder, my child's a self-harmer, my child's got, let's send them to a professional. But what we're seeing is self-harm, eating disorders, childhood complex trauma, ADHD, complex trauma. Um, so instead of saying, oh, they genetically had that problem, say maybe we contributed to it a little bit, that we
Mm-hmm.
need to look at how we contribute. Ooh, that takes humility to do that.
No kidding.
And so we really have to be willing to face how we might have contributed to our children's issues. Instead of saying, something's wrong with you, I'm taking you to a professional to get you fixed. That, to
Yeah.
me, that has to change.
Yeah, no kidding. That seems to be the norm still today. Is it's not a it's yeah, it's what did you do? What's wrong? Like yeah, exactly.
So
The
let's take the judgment out of stuff, both for the parents and for the child,
yeah.
and just say, hey, trauma, let's understand it. Let's begin to see how I contributed to the trauma. Let's see to the child what I can do now to stop using my survival tools and learn new tools, and not be out trying to be angry and blame everybody. So to me, if we can just accept the trauma piece and take the judgment out of it, then we can have a chance that both sides can grow. And
Yeah. Absolutely. So why do you think like in the past, like with when my parents were early, in their 20s or even in the 80s, like in the 90s, there wasn't a lot of awareness and discussion about complex trauma or trauma necessarily childhood trauma. Now it's obviously becoming more common and more people are aware of it. Why today is it really starting to come out? And like why not then? Like what changed today that it suddenly now society and more people are becoming aware of it, and there's more people are getting help for their childhood trauma. What's so different today?
um, so this is going to get really big and philosophical for just a minute.
That's fine.
But to me, if you look at Western society, is built on kind of patriarchy,
Yeah.
and that came often out of a Christian worldview that endorsed patriarchy. But sadly, patriarchy was often abused. So I was saying that I think in the West, and I think every culture struggles with this, but kind of the most powerful tend to rise to the top. So that's resulted in patriarchy systems all over the world. And then often religions try to then back that. And so you get a lot of major religions that would back patriarchy. But to me, the problem is complex trauma is all about the abuse of patriarchy, the abuse of power. Um, and
Yeah.
so, but when you've got a kind of a religious, God told us it should be this way type of thinking, it's hard to get people to challenge that. So in the West, it's taken kind of feminism and equal rights movement and the Civil War in the States to go against slavery, all of those things that fought against all of that stuff. So that's just that slow attack on a very root that men, especially white men, are superior, and they should have things the way
Yeah.
they want, and everybody else should just get in line and be happy with that. And when people stop being happy with that and rebel against it, then things can actually change. And that's what I think is
Mm-hmm.
happening now due to the kind of the LGBTQ stuff, feminism, Black Lives Matter. There's just a growing awareness that we're not going to be dominated by a patriarchal system anymore. There's still a lot of religion that is supporting it, but that's changing too. So I
Yeah.
think there's just a growing awareness that we're all equal and we have to treat each other as equal. And if we don't, we're in big trouble. And it
Absolutely.
always does damage. And so I think we're at a point in society that there's just a growing realization and awareness that the whole patriarchal system we are handed has got some issues, and it has to all be challenged and rethought so that we all end up equal.
That makes, yeah, I totally understand because it makes sense. There's it the way society is set up right now and has been for hundreds of years. It trickles down to, like, especially like in the US after World War II, right? Like that's a really good example of how families changed, the way structure changed. It introduced the the wife staying at home. Well, I'm not saying it never was like that before, but it really emphasized a structure where the wife was at home taking care of the children, making dinner. The husband went out and worked all day, came home, and it was like there was very identical, like the roles were very set.
Exactly.
And yeah, and there was nothing, there was no belief, or like if there was an idea of a different kind of setup, like where the wife was the one that worked or had a degree or had a really high paying career job, and maybe the husband stayed home or they both worked, like that was a rare occurrence. And back then, like if the husband, of course, came home from war and was dealing with PTSD from being in the war as a soldier, takes it out, like he doesn't know how to handle it, and of course his belief is to suppress it and not talk about it and not do anything about it. He takes it out on his children, and then the children have CPTSD, which of course back then no idea, and they a lot of that behavior and like that they've learned and experienced, of course, goes on to their children. So it all comes from the top down, and when you really think about it, because they designed and they implemented things in ways of life and with capitalism and society, like all these different things that are the way they are, when you really think about it, in a lot of ways contribute to
Exactly.
today. Like, and yeah, it's like we can all take care of ourselves if we are aware of our mental condition and we realize that we're not in a good place and we need to get help. Yeah, we can take care of ourselves and get the treatment and start healing. It's just, it's unless there's influence, like a more influence on it, then it's going to be difficult to really have any kind of a change occur. Like
Exactly.
yeah, like even I know you're aware of in Canada, like it's a once a year where Bell does their mental, like Bell Let's Talk, right?
Yep.
And people are so into that and really push, like a lot of people are really into support, but after that it's kind of quiet. It doesn't get talked about like it does on that day. But in the US there's really nothing. Like there's really no support. There's like, and a lot of people that I've talked to in the past, the one major thing that really is lacking is proper and efficient mental health support.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And one way I would frame that is like the wild, wild west of Canada and the States. War, it's survival mode. The strong survive, not the weak.
Yeah,
And if you're struggling, you don't talk about it, because if you reveal your weakness, somebody else is going to take advantage of you. So
exactly.
we created that that self-sufficient male that doesn't need anybody, um, doesn't talk to anybody, is strong. So the problem with that is that was great in survival mode, but what happens when you get to a safe place where you don't need to be in survival mode? Are you able
Yeah.
to show your weakness? Are you able to talk and connect with people? Because survival mode doesn't allow for connection. Um, and so that's been the challenge is, okay, now we have a society that's safer, but if people are still afraid to get out of survival mode and show weakness,
Hmm.
then they're never going to get healthy. And so thankfully, some of that is beginning to change.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, exactly. I think the phrase that I've heard a lot is men don't show feelings.
exactly, exactly.
Right? Like they keep them to themselves, or they express it on their own, but they don't talk about it with their wife or their sister or their brother, or they don't talk about it to their parents. It's they keep it to themselves, and they, unless it comes out, like, I know, unfortunately, they either it gets too much, and then they have a mental breakdown, or they, right, they never get the help for it before it's so far that it's, like, it affects their daily life, or it affects their family, or it still occurs a lot, unfortunately.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, it's we do have a long way, like you said. We do have a long way to go, but we're definitely, there's a lot of, it's coming, starting to show more, and there's obviously a lot more discussion on it, and it's becoming a more open subject. But there's still a lot of people out there that are afraid to discuss it with anybody, or out of fear of negative, you know, repercussions, especially in a work environment. Like, it's not something that people will talk about. They'll rather make something up, or just not talk about it at all, and it affects their ability to do their, or be themselves and do their life.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's too bad. It's really, yeah, but I'm glad that it's getting there, and I'm glad there are more and more people who are finally, it's starting to become more acceptable, and yeah, eventually it will. Obviously, it just takes some time. Wow.
Yeah. Dr. Bruce Perry in his book, which is to me was quite encouraging. He said, whenever you try to make a major shift in society's perception of issues,
Yeah.
historically it takes about 30 to 40 years. Um, and that was encouraging to me to hear
Yeah.
that, because usually the initial response is just denial that this new way has any merit at all, because we just like the old way.
Exactly.
Then after a while you get then resistance. This is dumb, find fault with everything. But then eventually you get to starting to be open to consider it. And that's where I think we're at now. There's still resistance in pockets and denial in pockets, but there's more and more openness to it. And that to me is when it really starts to mushroom in a positive way.
Yeah. Yeah, I just hope that the openness and acceptance is better when the amount of people who are discovering that they have childhood trauma are really starts to explode, because I do worry that we're not going to have enough support for the numbers that will come.
Yeah, and that's why when we put our program online, um, like it grew 1,000% in 2 years.
Wow.
And it's just like, okay, the need is there. Our job now is to make sure we have the right staff and sufficient staff to handle that.
Absolutely.
Um, and so that's what we've been putting a lot of energy in, is that. But it's exciting to see people are starting to reach out for help. And
Yeah.
but I agree, we have to keep up with the demand if we're going to really continue to help people with maximum effectiveness.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think it was just at the end of May where I found your video and just kept like it doesn't happen often where the first video, catches me and says, okay, this is good stuff. Like, this is really good. And I just remember going to the next one and to the next one. And then I got finished that one. And then I went to, and now, I kept looking for more. And I think I've listened to 40, I think, in that time frame. I write first thing in the morning. I'll turn it on and I'll listen and I'll it's really the amount of information that's been provided has been extremely helpful, and it's given me ideas as well, because it expands my mind and my thinking on what this is and how to go about expressing my thoughts, and like it's calmed my mind in that way of going, all right, I'm now aware, even more so than I was a year ago, that this is what's going on. It's so obvious, and there's the questions and the doubt and the confusion is basically like at a minimal compared to a year ago, all because of what's been said on there, and there's so many different sessions and such a like it's really like it expresses exactly what people need to hear to get to the right step or take that first step.
And I would just say that in two ways, Russ. It's number one, so many people that have trauma have always gone, something's wrong with me, but I don't know what.
Yes,
and so
exactly.
Finally to have it explained, goes, oh, so that's why I do what I do.
Yeah.
Secondly, is they've never been validated in their pain, in their issues. And so to hear it validated is just like a load comes off. Oh, finally, it makes sense. I'm not weird. I'm not sick. It's trauma. And it just takes the stress off the person just to have that validated and explained.
Yeah, exactly. It's like I was told, my aunt told me what's going on. One thing you need to understand and believe is that you're normal. Like, you're not an abnormal or a unique person. You're a normal person, and many people have gone through this. This isn't something that is your fault. Like,
Exactly.
like kids grow up and they think it's their fault.
Exactly.
And they take that burden on themselves and they think that they're not a normal person, that there's something wrong with them. And just hearing that I'm a normal person and it's not my fault, really takes a load off.
Exactly.
And helps in that process towards healing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, that's all I have for today. Tim, thank you so much. Like, not just for myself, but like your this what you've been doing for the past couple, however 10 years, 20 years, and with this setup you've got and the React, and you're online now, and obviously you're expanded worldwide now, so it's not just in Canada like it was in the past. Like, you're going to be able to help so many people out there that are dealing with trauma and addiction and all these different areas in their life, and we need more of that out there, obviously, and it's just starting to get there. And on behalf, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of audience members who are going to be tuning in and discovering what you're supply, what you're offering to them. But yeah, thanks for doing that and for getting involved as much as you have into complex trauma. It's quite amazing.
So I was just going to say, if anybody wants more information, it's timfletcher.ca, and on YouTube it's Tim Fletcher Media.
Okay, excellent. All right.
So
Well,
just
yeah.
thank you for having me very much. Appreciate the opportunity to chat.
Yeah, you bet. You're welcome. This was something I was looking forward to for a while because it's something that I know my audience and people out there are needing and looking for to help them on their journey to, healing. So, yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for being on my show today.
Okay, we may
All
talk
right.
again.
You bet. All right. Thank you very much, Tim.
Okay.
All right, everybody, that's the show for today. My guest was Tim Fletcher. He's obviously an expert in CPTSD, and I hope you guys found this extremely informative and helpful. And you, like you said, you can get in touch with him. He's online on YouTube, and he has his website, and you can check it out. And I'm sure that would be very helpful for you as well. All right, that's it, everybody. Thank you very much. Talk to you later again. Bye.